live, please submit your question or comment in the comment section. We'll be monitoring the chat box throughout this webinar, so please be respectful and appropriate while participating. We will review the questions you've submitted in the chat box during the Q&A session, and questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Our agenda today includes an overview of the state of our birds and what they need to thrive, native plants for birds in your community, some best practices and resources, and invasive plants. My name is Erin Rowan, and I'm the Senior Conservation Associate for Michigan and manager of the MI Birds program in partnership with Michigan Department of Natural Resources. Today, I'm joined by Audubon Great Lakes Wild Indigo Associate, Jennifer Johnson, who works with communities in Chicago, Illinois, and Gary, Indiana. Our Conservation Manager for Indiana and Illinois, Daniel Suarez. And the Lake to Lake CISMA Coordinator based out of the Central Upper Peninsula in Michigan, Elise Desjarlais. Audubon Great Lakes is a regional office of National Audubon Society, and we work across the 5 Great Lakes states where we have over 200,000 active members, over 50 chapters, and 2 nature centers. We're really excited to be chatting with you all today about how best to support your backyard birds across the Great Lakes this fall. I'm now going to pass things over to Jen Johnson, who's going to share some information with us about the state of our birds and what they need to thrive. Jen?
Thank you, Erin. My name is Jennifer Johnson, and again, I'm a Wild Indigo Associate. The Wild Indigo program is a multi-generational program that connects underserved communities with their natural and local spaces. And that includes BIPOC communities, people with disabilities, and seniors. We currently operate in 5 cities across the Great Lakes. That includes Chicago, Lake County, Illinois, Northwest Indiana, Detroit, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And so now I'm going to tell you all about the state of our birds. So because of climate change, we've learned that in a single lifetime, North America has lost more than 1.25 of its birds. And according to a report in the world's leading scientific journal, Science, findings show that 2.9 billion breeding adults have been lost since 1970, including birds in every ecosystem. And the losses include iconic songbirds like our eastern and western meadowlarks, and favorite birds at feeders like dark-eyed juncos and sweet-singing white-throated sparrows. The disappearance of even common species indicate a general shift in our ecosystem's ability to support basic bird life. So as you can see here, how it affects our grassland birds. Over half have been lost. Our migratory birds like this Baltimore oriole, almost 30% have been lost. And our aerial insectivores. Audubon's own science tells us that birds are on the brink of extinction and shows that 2/3 of North American bird species are at risk of extinction from climate change. This report looked at 604 species and 389 bird species could lose as many of the places. For some species, they'll lose up to 100% of their habitat. The good news is that our science also shows that if we take action now, we can help improve the chances for 76% of the species that are at risk. The changing climate is causing North American birds to shift the timing of their migrations and has altered their summer and winter geographic ranges. Audubon science shows us that stabilizing warming at global average increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius would reduce threats for many birds. In the Great Lakes region, many species of interest are considered vulnerable to climate change under a scenario for a 3 degrees Celsius global temperature rise, including the bobolink and the common loon. You can see how much of the ranges are lost in red on the map. This rapid climate change could lead to population declines and local extinctions if we don't adapt. Now, before we talk about what you can do in your community, I want to provide some context. Here is the big picture. When we think about saving birds, we need to think about their migratory flyways or superhighways and protecting birds everywhere they go throughout their lives. Hundreds of species migrate through the Great Lakes region and through our community every spring and fall. And so that means your yard is an opportunity to fill in the gaps for migrants along the flyway, and also to make sure our breeding birds and wintering birds can succeed too. Your space can be an important stopover site where birds can seek shelter and refuel with food on their migratory journey. Audubon focuses on landscape scale conservation through the lens of birds. And although our backyards and porch gardens are our private oasis, we have to remember that they are connected and are pieces of this larger landscape. Right now is fall migration, one of my favorite times of year, which means summer breeding birds are moving south to their wintering grounds, as you can see here on the map. So before the birds take off for their wintering grounds, they look for signs that it's time to migrate. I made the acronym LEFT to help remember some reasons why the birds look to move to the south. Light, L. During the fall months, the amount of light diminishes. When there isn't enough daylight, there is a shorter amount of time for foraging for food or to build a nest. E is the empty nest. Once the baby birds are old enough to care for themselves, the parents move from the breeding grounds, and so do the young adults. F is for food. With the change in the season, reliable food sources become scarce. T is for temperature. Cooler temperatures may be uncomfortable for certain birds, so a change in the scenery is necessary. Some of our earliest to leave to go south are hummingbirds, particularly the ruby-throated hummingbird. Hummingbirds rely on nectar and flowers to survive. And when their choice plants have done flowering and they begin their journey to Mexico and South America for more food. And for birds like the ruby-throated hummingbird and other migratory birds, migration is very risky. Some of their threats include a lack of habitat, fragmented habitat, building collisions, and food availability. The vital role of restoring habitat in urban and suburban rural communities is growing. Back in the 1940s, our country looked a lot like this. Urban centers, especially in the eastern US, were essentially isolated cores surrounded by small farms and open land. And they've spilled out into the surrounding landscape by 1980. And it converted millions of acres into housing developments and urban sprawl. And you can see that the eastern half of our country has seen a tremendous increase in housing densities by 2010. and it's only going to get worse. This is the projected density of housing by the year 2030, so not very far off, a mere 9 years from now. Already, we've lost a staggering 150 million acres of ecologically productive land to urban sprawl. And over the past century, we have taken what was once a rich, contiguous landscape of ecologically healthy land full of native plants, and we've transformed it, much of it, into a sterile monoculture of turf grass, lawns, and decorative alien plant species. 50% of US land has been developed into suburban or urban matrix. And a patchwork of cities and towns with small remnants of fragmented habitat between them, even where there is available green space like our yards, the typical yard looks like this, which don't provide enough suitable habitat for birds like the wood thrush or other wildlife. The average American yard does not provide much for birds to eat or even places for them to hide from predators. And plants in suburban and urban areas tend to be 80% non-native. But these developed areas aren't lost. We've come to understand that actually suburban and urban areas are critical for birds, and we can all work to make them more supportive to both migrating and breeding species. And we can improve them by replacing non-natives with natives. Scientists call it structural diversity, but birds call it home. We may not be able to recreate a completely natural habitat in our yards, but we can go a long way towards creating something that serves the same function by thinking about habitat layers. Birds provide the canopy layer, trees provide the canopy layer or overstory, and the mid-story layers are created by small trees and shrubs. And the understory is provided by the ground cover of grasses and broad-leaved herbaceous plants. The more habitat layers you have, the more birds your space can support, even if it's a tiny yard or container garden. In addition to adding structural diversity to your space, simply reducing or eliminating pesticide use can make your property healthier for birds as well as your family and friends. And if you Google how to create a brush pile, you get a lot of complicated instructions, including cutting down trees and shrubs just to make your brush pile. It doesn't need to be complicated. When you're pruning, take a pile somewhere in your yard and maybe in a back corner. Take a look at it and consider, are the branches far enough apart to allow the bird to quickly fly in and out, but close enough to keep out hawks? And are there nice perches in there? Is it big enough and thick enough to provide cover, but still leave room for the birds? And the large branches on the outside provide structure so that it doesn't fall down in the wind. And among the birds that will inhabit your brush pile are the white-throated sparrow, juncos, cardinals, towhees, and wrens. Brush piles not only provide shelter and cover, they provide good foraging habitat and in the enriched leaf litter beneath. And birds need water just as much as humans do. Bird baths can provide birds with drinking water, bath water, water to cool down in on hot days, And it's important to refresh the water and clean out the bird bath daily to prevent the spread of disease and keep the water clean for bathing and drinking. You can also purchase bird waterers that are like bird feeders. These could even go on hooks, on balconies, patios, or even window hooks if you're living in an upstairs condo or an apartment. And many of our cavity nesting birds are struggling because development means fewer snags. If it's safe, leave it up. Not only do snags provide home for birds like these tree swallows, chickadees, and titmice, nuthatches, and woodpeckers, but they give birds a place to rest and a place to perch and to wait for tasty bugs to fly by. Also, if you have no snags or trees in your space, you can install bird houses for cavity nesting birds. So now that you know about the state of our birds and a few things that you can do, here are more ways you can make a bird-friendly yard. And so I'll pass this on to Daniel.
Thank you so much, Jen. Can folks hear me now?
Yes, we have a little bit of an echo going on. So we'll just wait for you, Daniel, when you're ready to go.
Can folks hear me now?
Perfect.
Can folks hear me now?
Yes, we can hear
Okay,
you.
sorry about that, everybody. Now I'll have to just speak a little bit faster as I go through these slides. So we've covered how you can create a space with a high diversity of plant species and layers of vegetation to meet birds' needs. The tree canopy, the shrub layer, the ground cover, and leaf litter. Now it's important to tie all that in with the other aspects that make your yard bird friendly. And so to review, we should plan for birds throughout their annual cycle. We should provide native plant foods for all seasons. We should plant in layers to provide structural diversity in your habitat. We should provide a source of clean, fresh water, and we should provide shelter for roosting and nesting sites. So why native plants for birds? This slide of a Wilson's warbler eyeing a caterpillar gives you a big hint as to one of the main reasons, which we'll get into in a moment. But there are a number of reasons that native plants are the best for our birds and other wildlife. Next slide. So our native birds have evolved with native plants. Native plants provide both resident and migrating birds what they need when they need it all year long. Native plants provide shelter and nesting sites, as well as food in the form of berries and fruits. And the fruit of native plants, in most cases, is made up to 50% fat. So out of that entire berry, 50% of that is made up of fat, which is 10 times more nourishing than most non-native ornamental berries. And as birds are going on these marathon migrations, fat is very, very important. Nectar, which we'll touch on in a little bit, applies to a small subset of birds, but still an important food source. Nuts and seeds, which we'll also get into. And the fourth food group is something that we don't necessarily think of as being provided by plants. So I wanted to challenge everyone to put your guesses into the chat for what you think this fourth food group could be. So I'll give folks just a couple of seconds here, and then we'll move on. All right, I see some answers coming in. Go ahead, Aaron, you can click through the next slide. Oh yeah, just some pictures of our food groups here. Insects. And you can go on to the next one too, Aaron. So pat yourself on the back if you got that one right. did provide a clue. So thanks for answering, everybody. And here's the wood thrush providing our answer. Bugs, insects. So this parent is feeding its chick a really juicy looking caterpillar. And indeed, 96% of land birds, like the wood thrush, feed insects to their chicks. Almost all baby songbirds need protein-rich insects to properly develop. And if parent birds can't find those bugs, they have nothing to feed their babies. So we've learned that most of our native land birds must find bugs to feed their chicks. But what does that have to do with native plants? So on the left, we have a native oak tree, and on the right, a non-native ginkgo tree. Our native oaks, which are in the genus Quercus, are host to over 550 species of caterpillars, which is pretty mind-blowing. Whereas the ginkgo, a commonly planted ornamental landscaping tree, supports only 5 species of caterpillars. And when you're a bird in search of food for your young, that difference is critical. Exotic plants that dominate the landscaping industry are, for the most part, unpalatable to our native insects. In fact, that's a large reason we have planted them. They're marketed even as pest-free. Unfortunately for our young birds, pest-free means a sterile environment with no food for young birds. And our current understanding of the importance of insects to native birds and the importance of native plants to our native insects is largely thanks to the pioneering research of entomologist Doug Tallamy. And if you've never read his famous book, Bringing Nature Home, I would highly encourage you to check that book out. And the importance of native plants to all animals, including humans, is largely about insects, particularly the caterpillars of butterflies and moths. Plants are the only organisms that can transform the energy of the sun into food. And insects are the world's primary herbivores, the plant eaters that transfer all that energy to the rest of the food web and subsequently to birds. Native plants and insects have co-evolved over millions and millions of years. And our native insects are not adapted to feed on non-native plant species, which dominate our traditional urban and suburban landscapes. So it's quite simple. Without native plants, native insects have nothing to eat. Without native plants, we don't have the insects. And without the insects, we don't have the birds. And of course, we know that insects are critical to our environment in many ways. Our insect pollinators are under threat from loss of native host plants and from pesticide use. And this story is exemplified in the familiar looking creature, maybe to some, pictured here, making its way along a native milkweed leaf, hint, hint, metamorphosing into the monarch butterfly, which, like many of our native pollinators, including bees, butterflies, and moths, is in trouble. And they too rely on finding fragmented food sources in people's yards as they migrate down to Mexico. And another quick example, just because I know the monarchs get most of the attention, I wanted to just call attention to another interesting butterfly caterpillar host plant relationship, the spicebush swallowtail. And the majestic spicebush swallowtail butterflies begin as this Pokemon-looking caterpillar on the left and eat the leaves of spicebush as its primary source of food until it can reach its full maturity. And native plants, and particularly native tree species, host an astonishing number of caterpillars. And to get back to our birds, therefore, an astonishing amount of food for baby birds. And you can see here with these figures that were drawn from that Doug Tallamy book, Bringing Nature Home, that there are many options to choose from when trying to plan your bird-friendly yard, including pine trees for those of you tuning in from the upper reaches of the Great Lakes states. And baby birds eat a lot. A chickadee pair brings 390 to 570 caterpillars to the nest per day, according to a study that was done a few decades ago. And these chickadees start out very small. Their eggs are like the tip of a pinky finger. And in just over 2 weeks, each one of these little birds has grown from the size of a tiny egg to a little bird covered in feathers that can fly out of the nest. And so chickadees feed their young for around 16 days from the time they hatch to the time they fledge. And so if you do some simple math there, 570 caterpillars per day over 16 days is over 9,000 caterpillars. And if the insects cannot eat the plants in our landscape, the food chain is essentially broken. And a world without insects is a world without birds. But it's more than that. It's a world without biological diversity, including us. It's not a stretch to say that without insects, we would all go hungry. So food group number 2, another critically important source category of food is fruit, especially this time of year during fall migration. This time of year, there's not really many caterpillars active on our native trees and shrubs. Instead, there's a plethora of ripening berries and fruits available to sustain our migratory birds on their journeys. And for example, spicebush, it's a must-have plant for helping migratory birds, including the wood thrush, which we've been going back to over and over again. And just to point that out again, I wanted to hammer this home, that the spicebush and many of our native shrub species produce super high fat fruits, where almost 50% of the content of the fruit is fat. And that's vital for migratory birds. You can go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, go back to that slide one more time. Sorry, I just have a couple more things to say. And so native plants are not just important as hosts to insects, but many native shrubs and trees produce fruit with high energy and fat content, which is important for birds building up their fat reserves for fall migration. And a recent study by Susan Smith et al. Found that migratory songbirds consumed fruits from native plants like dogwood at a faster rate than fruits from invasive plants. And the fruits of the native plants, as I've said many times, hammering this in over and over again, are of greater nutritional value to migratory birds than the fruits of invasive plants. Okay, now you can go to the next slide. And nectar, of course, is an important food source for hummingbirds. There's only a small number of species who consume nectar as a major food source during migration, but it's still important to understand. And it's important to remember that red tubular flowers are classic plants for attracting hummingbirds. Most insects cannot detect the color red, and it's a color that sticks out very, very much to a hummingbird. So if it's a tubular flower, that's red, it's likely going to attract hummingbirds. And so here's a ruby-throated hummingbird on her way south for the winter with a 500-mile nonstop crossing of the Gulf of Mexico ahead of her. She's less than a nickel. And if she doesn't have enough fat to make it across the Yucatan, she'll simply fall into the water and drown. So your yard is on her way and she needs to fatten up. So giving her nectar for refueling with cardinal flower, wild columbine, or wild catchfly, for instance, give them a favorite nectar source to get them to the next stop on their journey. And fourth, last but not least, seeds and fruits. Nuts and seeds. These provide a long-lasting source of food that endure throughout the winter. So right now, blue jays are going nuts, literally, stashing enough acorns to last until next spring. And while this jay only has one in his beak, they're capable of carrying up to 5 at once. Now, not only is this an important food source for birds, but blue jays fill an important ecological role, caching 3,000 to 5,000 acorns in one fall season. And as many of those acorns fall out of the tree into the ground, they provide the next generation of oak trees to sustain our migratory birds. And purple coneflower. So this is a really popular landscaping plant, quite arguably the most successful crossover native plant into the mainstream. And it's cherished by the American goldfinch. And this bird is often overlooked in the winter because he loses his lemony feathers. And you can keep him in your yard by avoiding deadheading. So by leaving the seeds standing on your coneflower, goldenrods, and asters over the winter, you're providing birds with a vital food source during a very difficult time. And with that, I'm going to transition it over to Aaron Rowan, who can tell us a little bit about things that we can do in our yards.
Thanks so much, Daniel. I really loved hearing about all the different food groups that birds rely on that we can help support in our own communities. Also wanted to thank Jen for sharing with us all of these big changes happening across our landscape that are really causing a downward trend for birds. Facing that, a lot of us might be thinking, what can we do, to help combat these threats? But that's where Plants for Birds come in. So we can all do a small part right where we live to help the birds that we love. So in addition to trying to cover those 4 food groups and provide shelter and water for birds, one of our best practices could be to do less yard work. You heard it here first. You don't have to do any fall yard chores. We are recommending that you leaf your leaves and let your plant stalks and roots stand. If you do choose to deadhead, like Daniel was saying, you can remove spent flowers to encourage more blooms and then place those full flower heads in a bird feeder so they're still accessible to birds in your backyard. Additionally, fall is a really great time to plant trees and shrubs. Right now, plants can focus on extending their roots down instead of creating foliage, which can encourage stronger plants in the spring. In addition, it's a really great time to get discounts on fall plants and some of your native perennials. This is also a really great time to focus on removing invasive species within your spaces and trying to experiment with some cover crops to re-vitalize the soil. Cover crops are grown to replenish the soil during colder months, so you can think of them as a green manure. Some examples include oats, winter wheat, winter rye, and buckwheat. Lastly, it's a great time to map out what you currently have. You can get a label maker, a journal, and some colored pencils to map out your current space or start planning for the spring. Here are some great examples of what you can do with some graph paper if you want to do it to scale as well, sketching out what you currently have and kind of what you hope to see over the next several years in your space. So this is a yard with just a few standing trees and shrubs and some evergreens. And on this side, they've added layers of intermediate shrubs and low shrubs. You can also have some low shrubs, wren house, different placement of bird feeders, a flower garden. So you can really plan your space to try to attract the birds that you hope to see in your area, as well as trying to provide all of those food groups that Daniel went over. Another way to plan is to actually kind of sketch out what things will look like once they're in full bloom. A lot of people want to see a variety of colors in their yard or want to ensure that they have different plants blooming at different times of the summer and fall season. So you're providing that food source to birds throughout a longer period of time, but also to pollinators. Some folks also like to plan their spaces by grouping native plants together. So here we have some cardinal flower and native bergamot. So more of kind of like a patchwork of native plants. Whereas some folks like to mix their seeds together. So it gives it more of a native grassland or wildflower garden look. So those are two other options as well. If you have a smaller space for a pollinator garden, you can mix up some seed and get it out in the ground in the fall or spring. So our hope is that we can take a landscape that looks like this, where it's very manicured and doesn't have a lot of nutrition for wildlife, into an area that looks more like this, that's providing that nourishment for birds and other wildlife and helping to support native insects. But you all might be wondering, how do we get started? How do we know what plants are best for our area? How do we know what sunlight needs these plants have or what their growth height is? And Native Plants for Birds database by Audubon is a great resource to get started and to help you in your planning efforts. We're going to run through how to use this tool over the next few slides. So if you Google Audubon Native Plants database or Native Plants for Birds, it should take you to this landing page where you can enter your zip code. Once you hit that search button, a list of native plants specific to your zip code will show up in a best results list for you to sort through. And it gives you a description of the plant, how tall it grows, when it blooms, what birds it might attract. So it's a really, really great resource. And you can sort the results in a few different ways. You can search by plant type here, selecting grasses, trees, evergreens to fit your needs. You can also search by plant resources or some of those food categories that Daniel was talking about. We have caterpillars or insects, butterflies as well, if you want to put in some host plants for those pollinators. as well as seeds, nuts, and fruit. You can also choose to sort by type of bird that these plants attract, which is great. This is one tool that I've definitely used trying to get goldfinches and orioles into my space. It's been really helpful to help find plants that are really liked by those specific species. In addition to going through the best results tab, you can click on the local resources tab, and this will connect you to local Audubon chapters in your area that might be able to provide you with some guidance and walk you through planning a native garden space. Additionally, if you continue to scroll down, there can be local and regional resources as well listed. So some master gardener associations could be found there, as well as where to buy native plants near you. We have a great list of native plant nurseries that have been added to this database. So that can help you find native plants to purchase, as well as some online native plant retailers. We know it can be really challenging to find native plants. Most of the garden centers and big box stores around us often have invasive but non-native species, but also nativars, which we should all be aware of. A lot of these look like native plants and sound like native plants. They even have similar names, but they're often combined with some brand names like pink lanterns or ice ballet. And these are plants that are not entirely native plants. And unfortunately, they're easier to find and to purchase, but they don't support native insects and birds in the same ways that true native plants can. Similarly, these non-native species can also be detrimental to bird and ecosystem health. With that, I'm going to pass things over to Elise Desjardins, who's going to help us learn more about common invasive plants, what we can do to remove them, and also why they are not so great for our birds and local wildlife. Elise?
Thank you, Erin. Appreciate it. So hi, everyone. My name is Elise Desjardins. I coordinate the Lake to Lake Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. As Erin had mentioned, we are located in the central Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And if Erin, you mind going to the next slide for me? We are one of a large group of these CISMAs. They're sometimes also called prisms, CWMAs, and we are collaborative partnerships that are, at least in Michigan, statewide. We cover every county within the state of Michigan. And regionally, these groups also exist into Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin. These groups are actually national. Not every state has complete coverage, but there is usually some local group that is working specifically towards addressing the lovely challenge that is invasive species management. And so, as I had mentioned, I cover the middle of the Upper Peninsula, but there are many, many other groups in maybe your locale that you could reach out to. And we all have a similar mission of working cross-jurisdictionally for invasive species management. And what that means is our groups are partnerships, collaborative efforts, and it's state, local, federal, tribal, nonprofit resources all coming together to see how we can work across landscape scale projects. Invasive species many, many times do not adhere to anybody's property lines or jurisdictional lines. For instance, national forests can only work on national forest lands. And if you happen to be a landowner right on that borderline and you're a private landowner, you can't go work on the forest can't come work with you. And so what CISMA and these cooperative groups allow us to do is cross those borders and work at the plant scale, if you will. And so they're really great groups to, as I said, be collaborative efforts and get landscape scale projects done with the goal of native restoration and invasives management. So if we could, next slide, Erin, thank you. So why are invasive species a problem? Well, we just heard how wonderful all these native plants are and what they do to environment. Kind of a 180 is what invasive species tend to do to environments. They crowd out native vegetation by being much more competitive. That is because they have no usually natural predators in a place where they are non-native and invading. Specifically for birds, those habitats can start to show reduced nesting capabilities, site availability for even stopovers, and for foraging and food availability. And a couple examples, you could see that they can even have an effect on a aquatic habitat, and they can block out sunlight. They can alter oxygen levels. And if any of our species are water birds and relying on those wetland ecosystems, that can be detrimental. And overall invasive species just tend to reduce ecosystem functions as a whole. And so all invasive species really kind of come with this, I guess I'd call it a theme, where that competition and overabundance pushes out our native species. Sometimes invasive species are then selected for because there's just so many of them. It's hard to find those native species in that ecosystem anymore. And so that invasive or non-native species then getting pollinated, getting dispersed more, getting, all the reproductive success of being utilized by our pollinators, by our birds, by our wildlife. And that just keeps the cycle going. The natives never have a chance to catch up. So it's this terrible cycle that kind of compounds itself. And that's really not a good thing on an ecosystem level. Next slide, please, Erin. So to kind of come back to some of the examples given earlier in this presentation, we have the food sources for our migrating birds, and Daniel nicely mentioned all the berries, and in native species we're seeing that wonderful fat content, and it's rich in protein and other nutrients. And non-native berries are kind of the equivalent of just drinking some really terribly watered down sugar water. It doesn't have that fat, it doesn't have that protein, it's not as nutritional, but they're very, very abundant. And so these are some species that are non-native, and some of them are also invasive. And so we have examples such as buckthorn, common or glossy down at the bottom there, autumn olive, and Japanese barberry, which, as Erin was saying, is still available at big box stores, at least in the state of Michigan, as a landscaping species. And all of these berries are abundant and readily available. And when birds are eating it, it actually upsets their GI tract. It's a non-native food. It's not a good source of anything. It goes right through these birds. And so in the next slide, we will see what happens when those birds stop at a backyard, at a landscaping project, something like that, with these non-native berries. They go a little bit into our woodlands where they're trying to just take a little minute and settle themselves and disperse berry seeds. And so what we have and what we have seen over and over again is suddenly forest understories that look like these two pictures here. The top picture is a barberry infestation on an understory of a forest floor. The bottom is very similar with autumn olive. A very prominent issue with barberry is that it also tends to harbor specifically deer ticks, also called black-legged ticks, and those are the vector for Lyme's disease. So if you have an understory looking like this and it has a whole bunch of ticks in it, not only do we not have good, healthy understory for all the species that require forest floor, but we also now have a potentially infectious understory as well. So it can have multiple effects, not just on ecosystem levels, but even on human health and other species health consequences as well. And autumn olive can invade understories, but also it is a rapid invader of open spaces. And so this species, unfortunately, was actually planted as a windbreak in many places, and windbreaks are in areas that are nice, open fields. Potentially those fields are trying to be converted back into grassland, into prairie, and all of a sudden if you have autumn olive popping up, it is no longer that nice prairie and grassland and open spaces where different types of species also need. And so it can completely actually alter an ecosystem from open spaces to crowded thickets as well. So definitely seeing how it alters ecosystems with very real life and real-time examples. Next slide, please. So the next example is nectar needs. And while we have our bird species that are nectar needing species, such as the hummingbird that was mentioned, nectar sources coming from native plants are so much healthier, similar to the berries. It's just a much more nutritional resource for those migrating species, for pollinators, insects and birds alike. And some of these species, the ones listed at this slide, are on the left, invasive spotted knapweed, and on the right, Japanese knotweed. And both of these are prolific flowering plants. You can see on one plant there are how many different individual white flowers on knotweed. Knapweed is a species that takes over open areas, and you'll just see a sea of purple. And often when I'm interacting with people that have seen some of these invasions, they say, oh, but I see all these bees and birds just flocking to these species. And what's happening is our native plants are then being overlooked by pollinators because there's such an abundance of these flowers. They're visiting them first. Our native plants are not getting that visit from their pollinator, potentially getting underserved by their pollinators, and the nectar coming out of these plants is not as nutritious. So again, seeing how that cycle can just continue itself when there's invasive plants present. Next slide, please, Erin. Thank you. And finally, I'm going to touch on how invasive species can affect habitat loss, not just obviously the food sources, but entire habitat regions can go away. And we were talking earlier with Jennifer about, backyards are breaking up different habitats and that biodiversity loss, but some of our big natural systems can also experience habitat loss simply because there's invasive species present. An example on the left is invasive Phragmites in a wetland ecosystem. And wetlands typically are, crowded in some places, a little bit more spread out in other places, dependent on what plants are growing there. But that serves its function as those crowded places are sheltering areas. Those open places are foraging, open, social areas for our wildlife. If there is Phragmites through the whole thing, the entire wetland ecosystem can be this dense, tall, in this photo is probably one of the most ridiculous examples of how tall Phragmites can get. And birds can't even get down to the ground level to nest, to forage, to breed, to do any of the things they're supposed to be doing in that wetland system. So an entire wetland area can be completely taken over, and we can lose that habitat very, very quickly. And an invasion example on the right is unfortunately Hemlock woolly adelgid. It is a non-native invasive insect species, and it is wiping out hemlock stands. The Appalachian Mountain Range has already seen a decimation in their hemlock population. It has been detected in Michigan, where hopefully, fingers crossed, on top of it. But what an example could be in this picture is that you see the dead hemlock standing above what is the rest of the canopy as deciduous trees. In the wintertime, deciduous trees drop all their leaves, we know this, and birds usually turn to those conifer species for that thermal cover, for that nesting cover, for whatever they need to shelter in those trees. And if those trees are also dead, suddenly we don't have any wintertime habitat for these birds. So habitat loss can be more than just urbanization. It can also be the loss of the healthy ecosystem functions of our native habitats as well. So something to keep in mind of why invasives can be a problem at a bigger scale. And so on our next slide, I will go through what happens if you think you have found an invasive species, if you have questions on invasive species. I've listed with logos some really nice resources to go to, Forest Service, DNR, there are there are local resources such as your CISMA, conservation districts, and then all the different wonderful nonprofit groups that have been involved in this webinar today. But a wonderful tool that broadcasts all of these is the MISIN platform. It's the Midwest Invasive Species Information Network. And next slide, please, Erin. And so what this tool is a really great platform, and it can be used on a phone app, and it'll look just like this on your phone if you go to download it, or it can be used on a web browser as well on a desktop. And what this tool allows you to do is look up, species information. It'll help with ID. And if you think, hey, yes, I think I found something, you hit that send data button, and it will send a report to any resource manager that is on the list to receive those reports. So for me, if you're in my CISMA area, anywhere in that 4-county area in the Central Upper Peninsula, if you hit send data, I get that report, and I have more people putting that data in and being that eyes on the forest, eyes on the ground, helping us manage these invasive species. Next slide, Erin. And so you can download, if you want it as an app, from either Google Play, App Store. It's readily available. It has a ton of information in there at your disposal to help you identify and report different species. Again, you can also do this as a desktop application on a computer as well. So I highly recommend giving that a look and seeing if you can help us find something in getting through to manage our invasives across big landscapes. Next slide, please, Erin. And then that's actually it on my slides as well. So with that, I'm giving it back to Erin, and thank you all for your participation.
Thanks so much, Elise. I really appreciate learning about the CISMAs here in Michigan, but also that there are similar conservation organizations across the country that are working to combat invasive species. I'm going to pass things over to Emily Osborne for some Q&A. I know we have just a few minutes left.
Thanks, Erin. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us this afternoon and for sending in all of your really great questions. So we're going to go through a few of them. And the first one we have is, we actually have a lot of questions about particular plants and if they're good for birds or not. And so I wanted to start with, are hazelnuts and goldenrod good food sources for birds?
I can take that one. That's okay, Emily. So yeah, hazelnuts and goldenrods are very good sources for birds. With the hazelnuts, it's important to remember that just like the acorns, there are a small set of birds that actually can eat those big nuts and acorns. So it won't be useful to the warblers and the smaller songbirds. But hazelnuts are useful, and I know at least in the Chicago area where I am, it's frequently hard to find those nuts on a mature hazelnut because the animals always get to them as soon as they're ripe first. As for the goldenrods, there are many species of goldenrods native to the Great Lakes states. So it's important to understand what kind of goldenrod you have. And I saw a comment earlier in the chat that someone said that the goldenrod was overtaking their yard. There are some goldenrods which in a home garden can spread very aggressively. So finding some of those less common goldenrods will be both better for the birds and then also for your sanity as you try to manage your yard. And for as opposed to the big hazelnuts, the goldenrod seeds are small enough that they do comprise a major food source for those migrating songbirds in the fall.
Thanks, Daniel. We have a question from Facebook, so thank you to everyone who streamed in on Facebook. The question is, how do birds know where food is? So this is something that's puzzled this person who asked the question. How do they get from such great distances to feed and to find food?
I've been on this one a little bit. So one of our slides when we were chatting about how the landscape has been so altered and kind of showing the bird's eye view of a suburban landscape. There was an additional slide that showed like a chunk of green space within that landscape. And so birds really, as they're migrating south or north to their breeding grounds, rely on some of those pockets depending on what the weather is, if they need to hunker down for an evening or they're settling in for the day, if they're nocturnal migrants, they will flock towards those little oases within these urbanized landscapes to rest and refuel. So that's one way that they can find you is just by having some of that green space available. And as far as, migrating long distances, there are a few things that birds rely on that Jen somewhat mentioned as well. The change in day length can signal a response in their central nervous system that tells them, oh, it's time for me to start migrating. It helps release some hormones in their bodies. They also, as far as being able to travel and not get lost, some bird species use stars to help them navigate, and others we're just finding out might actually be able to see the magnetic field, which is really interesting. They're finding some new chemicals in birds' eyes that could potentially allow them to see magnetic fields. But with that, I'll open it up to Daniel if he has any other, or Jen on any other input on why birds are able to find, or how birds are able to find food sources.
Could you repeat the question for me, Erin?
Yeah, it was to see why or how birds are able to find food sources during migration, and also what, yeah, how they migrate such long distances.
Well, some birds are able to just remember from previous experiences. So they're able to just go back to where they were. They had encountered food previously. Some birds are able to migrate long distances, some believe because of magnetic fields. So that's a way that birds have their own internal compass to navigate and find food. So that's one way.
Thank you so much, Jen. Thank you, Erin. I think we're getting close to the hour, so we have one last question that we can go over, and this one came in quite a bit, so I think it's a good one to end on. So can we speak a little bit about bird baths? Should they be offered? Can they serve as beneficial supplements to other natural sources like trees and plants? So just to speak a little bit about bird baths and how they come into the mix.
I'll just say very briefly. Go ahead.
Go for it, Daniel.
I was just going to say that very, very briefly that yes, bird baths are a great addition to the yard for sure. Not only for drinking water, but for cleaning themselves. And I would just ask that when people do that, don't just put the water in there and then leave it for a couple of months and letting it get all grimy and full of bacteria, but frequently changing out that water is an important part. But if you do that, then yes, it's a definite net plus for the birds.
And I'm sorry, I also meant in addition to baths, bird feeders.
Erin, do you want to take that one?
Sure, yeah. So I would say, yeah, bird feeders are another great supplement. I know some folks have expressed concern in the past of, oh, am I going to keep birds here and prevent them from migrating south? But usually those biological drivers tend to win out over an available food source, and the birds will continue to move south. I do think that bird seed, depending on the time of year and where you live as well, there are some recommendations on what you should put out and when. Typically during those summer months, like Daniel mentioned, birds really rely heavily on those insects. So you will likely need bird seed out less, but during spring and fall migration, when they are going these long distances and need that additional resting and refueling options, it could really help them on their journey south.
All right, thanks, Erin. I'm going to pass things back over to you to wrap up the webinar and let everyone know how to best stay in touch with us.
Great, thanks, Emily. Yeah, if you're interested in learning more about how you can get involved with Audubon Great Lakes, MI Birds, Lake to Lake CISMA, or Wild Indigo, you can reach out to all of us here, the presenters directly. You can also find us online. We have our website at gl.audubon.org, and we can be found on social media as well, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I really hope you're able to stay in touch to get involved, and if you have any questions following the webinar, also please feel free to reach out to us. We can follow up over the next week with a link to the recording of this webinar, as well as our webinar feedback form. Thank you very much for joining us today.